And now we are live. Darby, it's good to see you. I forgot to ask you how I should spell your name. What is the right pronunciation of your second name?
It's Vannier.
Vannier. Is it French origin, or where does it come from?
My family's originally from Germany, so I'm
Oh,
guessing the name probably changed when they came over at some point, but it's Vannier now.
okay. Where are you in the United States?
I am in Lincoln, Nebraska, so right in the middle of the U.S.
How is life there currently?
It's good. Right now, it's really cold here, but other than that, it's good.
Yeah, it's in Austria. We have. I'm here in Austria, middle of Europe, and we have spring coming. It's sunshiny, but it's also still cold. So it's we have
Yeah.
something in common. It's you said 6:30 in the morning. At
Yep.
your
It sure is. It's
sure.
early.
So it's an early morning conversation for you about.
Yeah.
Davi, you wrote a book that I believe is very interesting. The title is called The Indispensable Leader. What was your motivation to write a book on leadership?
It's kind of one of those things that, well, two things. So first thing is just throughout my career, I've kind of just kept notes on interactions that I've had and people that I've met and situations that I've been in and challenges that I've encountered. And I've always just thought, maybe someday I'll write a book. The other part of that is that obviously my whole career, I've been very passionate about leadership and leading people and building strong relationships with individuals and how we properly develop individuals. And so I really kind of went down this path of looking at the context of leadership just a little bit differently. So a lot of folks have heard the term or the question, are you a leader or are you a manager? And we've heard it multiple times. And I kind of start out my book with that. And I basically say, I don't really like that question. I don't think that's a good way to look at it because I know a fair number of people who would be considered managers who are also good leaders. And I think that when you say, are you a manager or are you a leader, you're saying you can only be one or the other. And I think that's a bad way to look at it. And I think in leadership in general, and this applies in business, it implies in political leadership, whatever, I think we have too much of this or that. Like you have to be either this or that. You can't have compromise. You can't have anything in the middle, when in reality, we should be taking the best parts of multiple types of leadership. So the book really goes down that path. And I ask folks to look at it a little bit differently and say, instead of manager and leader, let's say manager characteristics on one side and visionary characteristics on the other, because that's ultimately what people are talking about when they say leader. A lot of times is that characteristic of being entrepreneurial or high passion, lots of ideas and that sort of thing. The manager side is the folks who they're very organized, they're methodical, they check a box to get stuff done. They're the ones that make stuff happen. They're the ones that are asking the question, what are we going to do or how are we going to do it? Whereas the visionary, they're asking the question or explaining the why are we going to do it? Why is it important? Like they have the passion and everything. And there's good and bad traits to both sides of that. And so basically the book kind of takes you through this process of saying, you need to evaluate kind of where you lie on that spectrum. And then think about how do you pull in the best traits of the other side as well, so that you can really start to become the best possible leader that you can be for yourself, which is what I coined the term indispensable leader. And that's how the book kind of came about. So.
Yeah, that's true. I think you call it the two archetypes in your book, the two archetypes of leadership, manager and visionary. I believe it depends on the situation. It needs both. What I found interesting in the title is that you write indispensable, especially the term indispensable. When you open the internet today, especially when I look for information about blockchain technology, what I see there is the claim that it's like Bitcoin, for example, that the modern organization doesn't need leadership. It's decentralized. Nobody owns it. Nobody basically leads it. And you come up with the title In This World, your book was published in 2022, and say, no, leadership is indispensable. Why do you think it's indispensable in a decentralized world that we start evolving into?
Yeah, so I mean, I coined the term to refer to specifically to a type of leader that you should strive to become, but certainly leadership, and we should probably clarify and say good leadership, because there are bad leadership. There's bad leadership out there as well, but good leadership is certainly indispensable, and that it doesn't matter where you look at that. It doesn't matter if you're looking at a political level, at a government level, at a business level, at volunteer organization, whatever it is, you have to have folks who are willing to have those characteristics, to lead conversations, to direct people, to get people on board and motivated and passionate about a project or an idea or an initiative so that things get done. Because without that, you're going to have a whole lot of stuff that's either non-innovative, which we don't want, because that's why you really need those visionary characteristics, because visionaries come up with a lot of ideas and generate multiple new ideas, and a lot of innovation comes from that. But you need the other side of that too, where you need folks who have the ability to then take that idea and that excitement and actually generate a plan for the steps to how to get it done. Because if you only have one or the other, you're going to have somebody who can just check a box and do stuff, who's not going to really know what to do because they don't know, have any great new ideas. Or if you're at the other end of that spectrum, you could have somebody who's high visionary, who comes up with 10 new ideas every day, but they never get done because there's nobody to actually focus on doing that. And that applies, like I said, whether you're in business, whether you're in just, volunteering in an organization and trying to help that organization, or on a government level, or anywhere.
Yeah, that's true. I completely agree. I mean, I think Bitcoin is the best example. So it's before 2017, it was basically a technology, and that's it. And while you were speaking, I thought there are leaders also in the Bitcoin world or blockchain world. When I think about Bitcoin, Michael Saylor, for example, he's pushing the storytelling for Bitcoin and is, in a sense, I would say, what you define as leader, one of the leaders that move the technology forward and help people with visionary thinking to understand how they can use the technology in the organization. So, for example, Anthony Pompliano on YouTube is also doing a great job in promoting Bitcoin, and these are in your archetypes would be the visionary leaders. And on the other hand, I believe there are many also managers in the background who move also the Bitcoin technology forward. I just think about the Lightning Network. So it really seems that you nailed it with the title of your book, Leadership is Indispensable.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah,
go ahead. Interrupt me.
You made a really good point there that I wanted to jump on, and that is that so while I encourage folks we should all be trying to build our skills on both sides of that spectrum. And I kind of ask people in my book to look at it from the standpoint of, rather than a spectrum where you're at one end or the other, which generally people will fall somewhere on that. But start to try to kind of look at it like a Venn diagram where it's two intersecting circles. So you're trying to find the best traits of both sides. And so while we can all work, and we should be trying to build those traits that we don't necessarily have or we aren't as strong in, there are also cases where in business, if you cannot build those to the level that you need them to, then you need to go find somebody who you need to hire to work with and have those sorts of things. And that's kind of the illustration you were talking about. We've seen it, especially in the technology world, multiple times. I mean, there's obviously lots of stories out there about Steve Jobs when he was building Apples, that he was high visionary, lots of ideas, kind of a tyrant early on with things. And he failed in the very beginning because of it. Ultimately, he figured out he needed to hire people around him that could help him with the other side of things. And I think you see that even in cases like with Bill Gates and with Mark Zuckerberg and all of those tech folks. Those are just the high profile ones, but that happens in business every day, in small businesses and medium-sized businesses all over the world. You got to hire those skills that you maybe cannot fulfill to help your organization be as successful as possible.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, talking about Steve Jobs, I said he's a tyrant. I think at some point in time, people must learn that nobody makes it alone, and that they need to hire people with complementary skill sets, which brings me to the next question. when I think about leadership, Bitcoin, for example, is no company, but there are definitely thought leaders on the market that support the technology and move it forward. When I go to organizations, I always get the feeling that people associate leadership with titles and with roles in the organization and think, when I'm the CEO of a company or when I'm at the C-level, then I'm the leader and I start leading. Would you agree to that? Or is there also leadership that is not connected to titles?
Yeah, so I do not agree with that because of the fact that there are certainly a number of CEOs that I have known over the years who are bosses but not leaders. I would not term them leader in any sense of any direction. So yeah, titles do not make a leader. You can have the biggest, best title out there and not be a great leader, or you could have no title at all. It also doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be somebody who has people reporting to you, although that's how we generally think about leaders. But a lot of times we will all start off in our careers or in college or whatever. You won't have people that are reporting to you, but that doesn't mean that you're not a leader. And in my book, I talk about this in the form of informal leadership. So you have folks out there who can be great leaders by contributing in ways that lend itself to great innovation and great decision making and the ability to get a lot of stuff done, and can actually shift and move a team even without having that team reporting to them. And I think that that's something that is undervalued and something that's not talked about enough in leadership and in companies. So that's something that we don't want to miss out on.
That's absolutely true. Speaking about teams, do you have tips for leaders about building, coaching, and strengthening a powerful team?
Yeah, so I mean, the big thing is there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, of course, but the big thing is you have to build really strong relationships. And so from a coaching standpoint, particularly if you're coaching your own team, which is generally how most of us are encountering coaching, is when we're coaching our own team. You have to build really strong relationships with those individuals because you have to have a high level of trust before you can get to the point where you can really have highly effective coaching. And what that means is you need to take time to get to know them. Obviously, you need to be compassionate and understand where they're coming from. Be friendly. You don't have to be friends with the people that work for you. I always tell folks, you should actually be very careful about being friends with your employees because it does lend itself to some challenges if you do that. Not that it can't be done, but it can be difficult. But you should be friendly, which means that you should show an interest in their life and you should show an interest in their career. That piece being one of the most important is looking at that as it's your job to help develop this person and help them move along in their career. And that's one thing that, like, throughout my career, I get the greatest joy out of seeing the success of others. In particular, I've had the privilege of working with a number of people throughout my career who I've promoted along, and then I moved on to other things, and I've seen them continue to excel, and they ended up in high leadership positions. That makes me incredibly proud. So you need to build those relationships because that will help you as you coach them so that you're kind of on the same level as them when you're having that conversation, because you don't want it to come off as being dictatorial or you're saying this is how you have to do it. Like, you should be having a conversation about why things are important. Let them talk through it. That's one thing with coaching, like, let them talk through it, because a lot of times they will come to the solution that you believe that they should be coming to. And if they don't, you can then, of course, make some suggestions, but be very careful about kind of saying this is how you should do it, because everybody leads a little bit different, and it doesn't mean that anybody is wrong. Like, your leadership style is different than somebody else's. I certainly lead differently than a lot of the people that have worked for me in the past, and I've had to be very careful about, like, sometimes you're watching somebody, you're like, no, if you would just do it like this, it'd be so much better. But is it? Maybe it is. It is for you. Maybe it's faster for you or it's better for you, but maybe for them, the outcome is going to be the same or better. So you just have to be really careful as you coach individuals in that way.
It's a very interesting thought. You mentioned relationship building is important, but not becoming friends with people. And I hear very often about the hire and fire culture in the United States. What is your take on that in terms of leadership? I mean, is it really necessary from time to time to also help people to leave the organization?
Sure, it's necessary sometimes. I will say that over the years, I have had to fire very few people because I will generally work to develop that individual and develop their skills. I've had a number of situations that I encountered some challenges early on with individuals at like an entry level where we had a lot of issues with attendance and being late and like some of those simple things that are not huge deals, but they're kind of annoying. And there's one individual in particular I can think about that I had issues with early on. And we had conversations and I talked about why is it important? You know, what does this look like to your coworkers when you're late and how that all works. And ultimately that person ended up being one of my best employees. And I actually made them a lead and then assistant manager, and they continued to progress. And that's one of those individuals I was talking about that I've been so proud to see them continue on. So I think that, yes, certainly there are cases that you do have to end the relationship with somebody. There are definitely cases if there's, high ethical things or there's like a significant issue, those are obviously, yes, you have to do that. There are other cases where you should be trying to develop them, and hopefully you can. But what will happen then is if you can't, you're going to reach a point where either that person's going to go, this isn't a right fit, which has happened several times for me. Like the person just finally realized, this isn't a great fit for me. I think I need to move on. And that's great. Like you should help them do that. If they choose to and they come to you, you should want them to move on and be more successful and help them do that. Yes, it's an inconvenience. Yes, you'll have to backfill the position. However, that will open up opportunities for you to be more successful as well, hopefully, because you can get somebody in there who maybe is a better fit. Then there are just the very few cases that I have, of course, had where you're coaching them and you're coaching them along and trying to develop them for a long period of time. And you just reach a point where you're like, this is just not going to work. And they're not realizing it. And you just have to have to sit down and have a conversation with them and say, this isn't working, like this is not the right seat for you. So maybe there's another seat within your organization, depending on how big your organization is, that would make more sense. You could try to move them there. Or again, you can have the conversation, and nobody loves having it, but you can have the conversation with them and say, I'd like to help you move on. Like, what do you want to do? Like have the conversation with them about their career and see if you can help them move on to another organization. That's a much better method, again, in relationship building, because hopefully that relationship that you build with them down the road, years later, maybe it will come back and like you'll be able to work with them again in some capacity and it'll make sense, versus if you just terminate them and say, you're terrible at your job or something like that, then that relationship's done. Like that bridge is burned. You are never having any sort of relationship with them or any company that they are with in the future. It makes it very difficult to walk that back. And it just isn't great for building long-term relationships.
Yeah, great conversation. I think your last two words, long-term relationship, what is leadership all about? Building relationships with people and between people that last for a longer time than just a month or 2 weeks. And when I think about bad leadership, this burning the bridges, it was always getting criticized, getting a lot of criticism without any input of where can I improve, where can I become better, what would be a different way to do things. And burning the bridges definitely doesn't help people to move forward. Darby, give me a little bit information on your background. What experience do you have with leadership?
Yeah, so my background is pretty diverse as far as types of businesses I've been involved in. So early in my career, I was in retail. I started my career actually as one of, 5 or 6 managers at a 22 screen movie theater in a city in the middle of the US. And that was an interesting experience because 22 screen movie theater, we had like 130 employees and Obviously, that was very retail and that sort of thing. And then I moved on from that and actually went even kind of more retail, in which I took over managing a retail store for Kinko's, which for the young folks out there, that is FedEx Office now. Kinko's doesn't exist anymore, but at that time it did. And at that time all Kinko's were open 24 hours a day. So that was definitely an interesting experience, managing a 24-hour store. I don't know how many times you'd work 9 or 10 hours in a day and go home and have dinner at night, and you'd get a phone call that the overnight person called in sick, and then you'd go back and work all night also. So I think the longest time I worked straight was like 42 hours straight, which I think I'm way too old for that now. I don't think I could do it today. However, so after that, I kind of got a little bit tired of the retail environment, and I thought, let's move out of this, because this 24-hour management cycle is kind of difficult. So I actually went into the nonprofit world, and I actually ran a International Livestock Association for alpacas for about 11 and a half years. And that was really interesting. So I did the whole nonprofit thing, nonprofit and livestock. So that was definitely different from anything that I had done in the past. And certainly that was not on my list of, I think this is what I'm going to do with my career, when I was in college, but that's where I ended up. And then after that, I moved on back into the for-profit world, into a leadership development company where we do leadership coaching, one-on-one coaching, leadership training, strategic planning for companies. So kind of throughout my whole career, it's been an evolution of different types of leadership that's just required different things. Obviously, in a retail environment, a lot of the individuals that worked for me were very young, very early in their career. That was not a career path for them. So managing those individuals is much different. Then in the nonprofit world, you're working for I worked for a 9-member board of directors that was located all over the United States. So I had to manage all of those personalities, and every year I would get new board members because they would switch out a few every year in an election cycle. So you had to run that whole organization and the business of that organization and grow it and everything and manage your team. But then you also had to manage and lead that board of directors, because they're only on for a short time, whereas you're there long term. So they're on for a term of 3 years, and you're carrying over from board to board to board. So you're kind of that institutional knowledge. So you play a much different role. And then when you throw in the membership as a whole, so the membership of that association was about 10 to 12,000 people. Whenever you encountered those individuals, of course, they viewed themselves as your boss as well. So that was always interesting. And I definitely learned how to deal with a lot of political environment type things within that industry, and how to navigate those things and be very careful with what you say and that sort of thing as well. And then I also had the opportunity in that to actually buy out a couple of companies while we were there, and actually go through a merger process with another international organization. So it was definitely an interesting time. And then I moved on to where I am now, where we pretty much hire all high professional. These are high intellectual, highly trained, highly educated individuals, because they're providing leadership coaching and training and strategic planning. So it's a much different environment, obviously, than when I started my career, when I was managing, a bunch of high school and college age kids, that it wasn't, their main goal was not, they just wanted a paycheck, versus now where I'm managing people who are highly passionate about leadership development and coaching and strategic planning and helping companies grow. And I mean, like, that's what they're passionate about. This is their life. So those roles are so much different with regard to leadership, all of them. And I've kind of had that evolution throughout time. And that's what's helped me along the way. If having that various amount of experience, I can relate to a lot of individuals as I coach them along the way.
Yeah, that's true. I'm very impressed. You said the longest time that you worked was 42 hours.
Yeah.
Straight. I mean, the longest time I did was 48 hours when I was at the army. How did you feel after 42 hours?
I think since you have obviously done it, you know that you can't hardly think. You have no clue what's happening anymore. I was worried about driving home at that point, and I didn't even have very far to drive. So But yeah, you're definitely very tired. And by that point, you're pretty much just a robot.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. You also mentioned while you were speaking that leadership evolved and developed, and I think also society evolved and developed. So when I was at university in the 90s, basically was, as you said, being young, working for getting a paycheck. And when I look now into my environment, it's more about fulfillment, about visions, how can we change the world and the world to the better. And I also think leadership changes with sudden changes in the environment. You write about a lot about leadership tactics. What would you recommend to leaders when there is a sudden interruption in the environment of the company? I mean, the last 2 years we saw SARS-CoV-2. Now we saw the situation with the Ukraine. How can leaders handle such situations for their companies?
Yeah, it's difficult. And here's the thing. I'm going to kind of sidetrack a little bit. Here's the thing about times of crisis. And I'll use the pandemic because everybody can relate specifically to that. As we encountered COVID-19 early in 2020, obviously a lot of change happened pretty quickly. And nobody knew what was going to happen and everything. And early on, I suppose it was probably April or May of 2020, I was actually part of a group of business leaders who got together on Zoom and met. And we had a large variety of types of leaders. We had some restaurants, we had some retail folks, we had some professionals, and they were from all over the United States. And we got together basically to talk through everybody's challenges they were encountering with trying to keep their businesses running and what was happening and everything, and see how we could help each other. And I remember on one of these calls, I can't remember what prompted the discussion, but I remember saying to everybody, I'm like, think of it like this, like, this is really difficult right now for all of us, like to navigate. It's really difficult to understand what's the right choice and if we're going to be able to make it. And certainly a lot of businesses have failed because of the pandemic. However, think what we're going to learn. Like that was the statement I made, like, think what we're going to learn. Here's the deal about crisis. Two things. First off, especially in business, crisis will breed a lot of innovation. So what happened here in the US, and I'm sure it happened all around the world, is as restaurants had to shut down and couldn't have patrons come in, they had to innovate. So the restaurants that were not good at takeout, that were not doing curbside, that were not doing online ordering, they had to quickly innovate those things and change up their business model. And a number of the folks that we had on this group had restaurants, and that's what they did. And those were the restaurants that were successful. Yes, they had a time that was very difficult. And yes, it was still a little bit difficult even after they got going with their model as far as doing curbside and takeout and everything. But they also developed online ordering, which they had never made a priority. Of course, there was some restaurants that had online ordering out there, large restaurants, but now all the small restaurants have online ordering for the most part and that sort of thing to make it easy for their customers to order and come in. And so when you have challenging times, you can have periods of great innovation as well. Certainly lots of things come out of that. The other side of that is and I also pointed this out to individuals is I said, you're going to be surprised what you learn about your leaders that you work with. And somebody said, what do you mean by that? I said, well, think of it like this. When times are good and things are running smoothly, you can hide a lot. Like you can suppress a lot of we all have some negative leadership characteristics. We just all do, either negative or I don't mean bad when I say negative. I just mean the things that are like not as helpful. So there are bad ones too, but we all have things that are just not as helpful. We can suppress those during times of during good times. During times of crisis, when things are moving more quickly, when we're more stressed, when we have to make quick decisions, it gets a lot harder to hide those things. So I said, well, you're going to learn your fellow leaders natural leadership type and leadership style is what's going to happen. In some cases, that's really good. Like you're going to be like, wow, this person really stepped up and I didn't realize that they had it in them. In other cases, it's going to be, wow, this person's a real jerk and I didn't realize that they were a jerk. And that's how it comes out. And I saw it in multiple people. Like I saw multiple cases that you had in people that I know that they just were not, when it came down to the time of crisis, they were not a great leader. And other people had to step in because they came down on it as saying, we need to lay people off and we need to fire people. And you all are doing stuff wrong. And you better be more productive if you want to keep your job. And that is not the way to motivate people, as we know. The people that were successful were the ones that said, we don't want to have to lay people off. Yes, I mean, they were honest. Yes, it may come to that. We don't want to have to go there. Let's all talk about this. Let's innovate. Let's figure out ways to do this. Where can we bring in other sources of revenue, generate new services or new products or whatever, that sort of thing. Businesses sprung up throughout the pandemic because of that. So you will get that natural leadership type as well, which is always interesting in those times of crisis.
Interesting points. I think leadership is very challenging in times of crisis. And as you said, you find the true leaders then who still have the guts to motivate people. And as you mentioned, come up with new ideas how to innovate instead of panicking and also spreading their panic to other people. When it comes to leadership, I often hear, I'm not a born leader. So why should I take up this or that role? What do you think about this term born leader? Are there born leaders out there, or is it something that people can learn?
Nobody's born a leader. I mean, everybody comes into this world in the same way, and you don't come into the world and immediately have leadership skills. They are learned. So I don't agree with the idea that leaders are born. I think that is entirely inaccurate because here's the deal. Every single skill that you have is learned, and it's based off of some form of past experience. Now, some people grow up in environments that do have more leadership ability because of the environment that they grew up in, that are encouraged to have that leadership ability and that sort of thing. But even that doesn't mean that you're not going to be a good leader later on, because you can always gain those skills. We should always be learning. So the first thing is past experience is a big thing for me. Like, we underestimate the power of past experience a lot of times. And I can illustrate this through a story in my career. I think I use it in my book as an illustration in a bit more detail. But early in my career, when I was at the movie theater that I talked about, one of the things that happened was, this is in the days before digital movies, so everything was still on film. And the movies would open on Fridays. So on Thursday, you would get deliveries of the new movies for the next week, which would be opening the next day. And they arrive on these, basically in these big canisters that are really heavy, that have 6 or 8 reels that are about, I don't know, 12 inches, 13 inches in diameter. And what you have to do then Thursday night is you have to take those 6 or 8 reels and you splice them together and you put them on this big platter that's this big flat disc, basically, and get them ready to go. Because the next day, what has to happen is then that platter spins and it goes through the projector, and then it spins onto another platter and winds itself back on. And that's how the movie is run. So every Thursday night, these new movies have to be what's called built up. So you basically splice them all together. The movies that are going to be sent back on Friday have to be torn down, which is what it's called, where basically you take the big platter and you basically put it back on the little reel and wind it to the end. You break the splice, and then you put a new reel on and you wind the next reel on and you break the splice. So that process has to be repeated for all the movies that are coming and going. And when I managed, when I was done doing my closing duties as a manager, I would always go help the projectionist do this process, because I couldn't leave until they were done anyway. So I'd get done with my closeout duties. I mean, this is a movie theater, so I'd get done at 12:30 or 1 o'clock in the morning. And then I'd go find the projectionist and see where they were at, and I would help them finish up. So I was tearing down one of these movies to send back, and basically there's a center ring in the middle that holds the whole print on the platter. And you wind it on and start it, and you have this little knob, and you can speed it up and slow it down as far how fast that winds back on. And I got this thing spinning pretty quick because I was ready to go home, and it's going along, and all at once this print like lifts up and it goes flying off into the projection booth, like, and it was like slow motion where you have that look where you're like, no. I saw like my whole life slowed down as I watched this thing fly across the projection booth and land on the floor in a pile of knots. So this is hard to picture, but it's not a case that you can just pick it back up and put it back on. That's not how this works. If you think about it, the best way I can illustrate it for people who don't know is imagine you had an extension cord that was 3,000 or 4,000 feet long you had, and you just threw it on the floor and jumbled it all up, and it's all in knots. Or Christmas lights, when you go to get them out at Christmas time when they're all in knots. That's kind of what it's like. So I spent the next, 4 or 5 hours slowly pulling pieces of film out and cutting them and unknotting it and pulling more out and then splicing that back together and doing the next section. And I had so many cuts and splices in this movie that I'm like, we're going to get billed for all of this movie. We're going to have to pay for it because it's going to be ruined. But I did the best that I could. That's all that could be done. So I got done at like 7 or 7:30 in the morning. And obviously I'm tired, but I went home and I showered and I turned around and I came immediately back because I knew my managing director was coming in about 9. And I stood outside of his door. I remember standing there and I'm like, this is it. Like, you're fired, that this is the end of your career here. And I went in and I told him the whole story. And I explained everything that happened. And I'm like, I don't think the center ring was in, and clearly I should have checked it. And it obviously wasn't. It came off, and here's what I had to do to fix it. And he looked at me when I was all done and he said, Darby, I appreciate you coming in to tell me. I appreciate everything you did to make it right. Go home and get some sleep. And that was it. Like, that was that. Like, he knew that I was highly stressed, but he also knew that I did everything I could to fix the situation. And that was it. I didn't lose my job. Obviously, I learned a lot from it. I always checked that center ring after that. But here's what that did. That was my first job out of college. Mm-hmm. And you know what that past experience did for me is every interaction that I have had with an employee who messed up or had a challenge or screwed something up, every interaction I have thought about that particular time. It totally changed how I lead people. And I've used the story multiple times because I've had people sitting across my desk that were looking at me like they were thinking they were getting fired because they screwed something up. And guess what I was able to do? I was able to say, we're going to learn from it. Let's fix it and move forward. But here's the deal. Let me tell you a story about my career. And I could tell them the story and they get so much more relaxed. Mm-hmm. But that's what I mean by the power of past experience. We don't know how significant specific moments are to other people. That moment for my managing director, it may have been totally insignificant to him. I mean, I'm sure it was expensive at the time and he probably wasn't mad or wasn't happy, but it may have been an insignificant moment to him. I don't even know if he remembers it today. But it was highly significant to me. So as leaders, we have to be very careful and cognizant of the fact that every moment is important. It's important to somebody, and every interaction may change the entire course of how somebody leads, may change the course of their career. And that's how important good leadership is. I mean, those are the things we have to think about.
Yeah, it's a great story. I was just thinking about kids, for example. There are many defining moments when you encounter kids. Yesterday, I was in the elevator and the door opened. The kid came in and he just looked at me and said, "Hi, what's your name?" So I also thought, I mean, this is the defining moment for the kid, but because how I react defines how this kid might see strangers in future. So if I'm harsh and unfriendly and just say, "Shut up and leave me alone," it might produce a different wiring in his brain than when I just am friendly and say, hi, my name is Chris, and what's your name? How do you do? And I think also when you talk about leadership and in your story, when people are emotionally charged, it's the best learning experience. And then it's really up to the leader how they react and what they ingrain in the hard disk, let's call it hard disk, or in the mind of the people.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great way to look at it, because certainly those things will sit in the back of your mind and you may not remember them for many years, or maybe you'll never remember them at all, but they have affected how you lead or how you manage or how you interact with people or something in your life. So they are very important.
Yeah, and as you said, I think every interaction with a human being is a chance to leave someone a little bit better or a little bit worse.
Yeah.
And these are these tiny, tiny little things that sum up in the long run. It's not, I think change is not something that comes suddenly in a big burst when it comes to relationship. It's often subtle, a little bit here, a little bit there. Past experiences, I think, is really something that people should think about. And maybe when there are some bad past experiences, it's helpful to get rid of them with a little bit of therapy. You also wrote about it. I found another term in your book that I would like to get more information about. Top 20 activities. What do you mean with that?
Yeah. So when I talk about top 20 activities, I'm talking about like the top 20% of activities you do on a day-to-day basis that are the most important things. So this all came about from in the late 1800s, there's a guy named Vilfredo Pareto, who was an Italian economist, amongst other things. He did a lot of things, but he studied wealth distribution at that time. And what he found was that 20% of the people held 80% of the wealth, which in today's world stands true in a lot of places throughout the world as well, sometimes even more lopsided than that. But what happened is over time, eventually, obviously he didn't name it this, but eventually this became known as the Pareto Principle. And basically it's what we know as the 80-20 rule, if you've ever heard this. Most everybody has heard of the 80-20 rule. And the idea behind it is exactly that. And it stands true in so many areas, and maybe not in that exact proportion, 80-20, maybe it's 90-10 or something like that. But there is a lopsided way of looking at it in most areas. And basically what it found is that it applies in so many areas, like 80% of your sales come from 20% of your products. 80% of your sales come from 20% of your clients. 80% of all customer complaints you get come from 20% of your customers. And that idea really stands true no matter how you look at it. Microsoft looked at this many years ago, and basically what they found is that 80% of all support calls that they got were related to 20% of all the bugs. And so what they did is they went and they said, let's solve this 20% first, because if we can solve this 20% first, it takes care of the bulk of our calls. They're going to have a way less call volume, and that's going to help us in the long run. And that's exactly what happened. It stood true perfectly. There was actually, there's an author named Timothy Ferriss. He wrote the book 4-Hour Work Week, which is an excellent book. If you want to know, read a book about how to hack your life. Yep. So you know what I'm talking about. So he actually said, he went in because he was trying to, so for those who haven't read the book, he was trying to find ways to make his life more simple and do the things he could do with less time. That's the idea of a 4-hour work week. And basically one of the things that he looked at was, he said, when I looked at my clients, he did find that he's like 80% of the complaints that I had were coming from 20% of my clients. So he said, I went and I fired those 20% of my clients. And he said, you know, you never want to turn away business. Nobody wants to turn away business, but it made it so much better because then I could focus on the clients that were less maintenance, that provided the most revenue. And it made sense for him. So we can use this as leaders in our lives also, and we should be. So when I coach people, basically what I do is I say, let's sit down, list out everything you do on a daily basis, not every single activity, but the main things that that are most important for you to do every single day. Like just list out everything. Okay, great. Now let's take that list. Now let's take the top 20% of that list. Maybe it's 5 things, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 2, whatever it is, take that list. Now, these 5 things, if you get these 5 things done first every single day, like this should be your priority. When you come in the morning, it shouldn't be checking email. It shouldn't be, reading the news or whatever. It should be get these 5 things done first, because if you do that every single day, you're going to be able to affect 80% of your success in the day. So let's get those things done first. The beauty about this is it's different for everybody. So depending on your position and your company and your priorities at the time, these things change. So for me, I gave the email example. For me, immediately checking email may not be one of my top priorities. Sometimes people call these high payoff activities. Mm-hmm. So it may not be one of my high payoff activities. However, for somebody whose job is an executive assistant to a CEO, that may be a high payoff activity for them to check email, because they have to help make sure that they can monitor that CEO's schedule and keep them on track and help them throughout the day. So that may be a high payoff activity for them. So it's different for everybody. The other thing about it is that you should reevaluate them every so often, every 3 months or every 6 months. You should sit down and make that full list again, because what happens is your priorities change. Your priorities as an individual, your priorities as a company, your duties sometimes within your job change depending on the time of year, because you may have busier times of year than other times of year. So those things change, and you should constantly be evaluating them. But if you can accomplish those things first every day, or at least make an effort to get as many done as possible, you're going to be much more successful at completing each day and growing your company and exceeding in your role than you would be if you come in and you work on things that are outside of that and those insignificant things.
I couldn't agree more. You are absolutely right. I was just thinking about when you start your day with watching Netflix for 5 hours, then you shouldn't be surprised that you don't generate revenues at the end of the day. So,
right.
This is
I guess unless you're a TV reviewer, right? Maybe
that's
your job.
Yeah. Then absolutely right. Then it's different. But I think for the average person or for salespeople, for example, if they don't do their sales calls the first thing in the morning and watch YouTube instead, then they shouldn't be surprised that next month or 2 months or 3 months, they don't generate any sales, which leads to the point when we come to the first encounter on the top 5 list. How can people build habits? How important is that in your opinion?
Yeah, so building habits is extremely important. It's something that we don't always think about. And the idea behind habits within business, you can actually back it up a little further. So again, I reference a lot of books. There's an author named Charles Duhigg. He wrote a book called The Power of Habit. And if you want to learn about the science of habit building and all that, it's highly technical, but it has a lot of business experiences in it and stuff too. It's a great book. You have that book as well?
I have it somewhere here. Just here. It's next to this one.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's the thing with this book. He has a ton of stories in there, but one of them I think is a great illustration of this. And it's the idea of when Procter & Gamble was creating the product Febreze, which if anybody doesn't know, it is a deodorizer. They have the spray, the air freshener, but then they have the deodorizer, which is how it actually started. They developed this product that basically eliminates odors. And it was amazing. They did all this testing and it was great and amazing. And they had great reviews on it and everything. Well, then they put the product out in the market and they marketed it as removing pet odors, and it removes the odor from your house and all of those things. And what happened is it totally failed initially. And they couldn't figure out why. And the marketing people were in hot water because they said that it was going to be great. And it ended up not selling well. And so they went back to the drawing board and they did all this research and everything. And what they found is that they had all these people who would buy one bottle of it and they had it under their sink in their bathroom or their kitchen or wherever, but they never used it. And when they asked them why they never used it, they said, well, I don't really ever have a need to, because I don't ever have, my house doesn't ever smell. Because here's the problem. Nobody thinks their own house has any odor. And that's what they learned, was like, nobody thinks that their own house smells. They think everybody else's house smells and they need the product, but not them. So even if they bought it, they never used it. So then they never bought it again. Even though the product worked really well. The other comment they got is when I use it, it doesn't seem like it's working. I can't smell it. Well, first off, they're used to the smell in their house, so they don't know when it's there or when it's not there. The other issue is that the original product had no scent. So it didn't smell when you sprayed it. So the marketing people went back and they did a couple of things. First thing they did was they added a small amount of scent to the product so that when you sprayed it, you could smell it. Then it's working. You know, if I can smell it, it's working, right? But the other thing is they focused on habit. So they said, we need to, and this is, we all know this is part of how marketers do this, and how, you know, nowadays, even technology, there's a lot of talk with social media and how they manipulate us and use our habits and everything against us. But basically, Procter & Gamble said, we need to build a habit around this. We need to insert it into people's lives so that it becomes habit. So they changed their commercials. Their commercials didn't focus as much anymore on elimination of odors or elimination of pet odors or anything like that, because nobody thinks their own house smells, so it's not going to do any good. What they focused on is imagery around the actual habits. So they would show somebody cleaning their house and their room, and they would vacuum and everything, and they'd get all done, and they would spray Febreze everywhere. And they started creating, they inserted that in as part of the habit of cleaning. Like, it's just something you have to do. And their sales skyrocketed. So that's just one example of like how important habits are. You can think about it on a daily basis. I use it all the time. I mean, we don't think about it all the time, but think about all the habits that you have. When I go to work on a daily basis, when I exit my house, I go out, I turn the doorknob with the same hand, I guarantee it, every single time. I turn around and I shut the door. I reach up with my left hand and I push my garage door button. I go down the 2 stairs. I get in my car. I start my car. I look in the mirror. I reach up with my left hand and I hold it up there as I'm backing out. And after I clear the garage, I push the garage door button and make sure the garage goes down. We all do it the same way every time. We just don't think about it. So basically what Duhigg says is it's building, he calls them habit loops, but you can think of it how you referenced things earlier, which is a program. It's basically a program. So our brains can't handle all the activity we have to do all the time. So they build programs. And it basically is a program that when you start a certain thing, it launches. This is an excellent thing because it keeps us from getting overloaded, but it's also a bad thing because when we need to change it, it's incredibly difficult. And here's the thing about those programs. They cannot be deleted. They will always be there. You can write a new program, but sometimes your brain gets confused as to which one, if they're very similar, which one should launch. And then it goes back to the old one. You can use this if you've ever changed jobs and you have to start driving to a new place of work. Like I've had it happen to me before where I just start driving and then I realize I'm driving to the old job or the old church or whatever. That is exactly that illustration. Now, we can use this and should be using this in business as well, because as we set goals, we should be trying to build habits associated with those particular things. So when you set a goal, a long-term or a short-term, let's say a quarterly goal, you need to sit down and think about what are the behaviors and habits that I need to build? Like, how do I need to think? And then what are the actions I need to do on a regular basis to make sure that I accomplish that? And then those actions are actually what you're going to want to set into habit. And if you can do that, then you'll actually be able to accomplish your goals much more quickly. It's very much related to what we were discussing earlier with the high payoff activities, in that you mentioned sales. Sales is an easy example. because you probably better be setting in habits that you need to make 20 calls a day or 50 calls a day or whatever. And you need to build that habit. And that's what needs to happen every single day so that you can accomplish your sales goals. But habits are so incredibly important in what we do. They're hard to change. And you, as you coach people too, you need to realize it's hard to change habits. So you got to give your folks some grace on asking them to change how they do something or that sort of thing, because it takes time. I mean, it's going to take time, and they'll sometimes revert back, and you'll have to, course correct and move on. So yeah, important.
I couldn't agree more. I think it was Bruce Lee who said, I don't fear the man who practiced 10,000 kicks once. I fear the man who practiced one kick 10,000 times. So it exemplifies also how important habits are in martial arts. And another book that is going in that direction, I think you know it, Atomic Habit.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. Who wrote it? James Clear. I loved running marathons 10 years ago. And the first time when I tried to run a marathon, I've just thought, okay, I have to do a 10K 3 times a week. And as I didn't run before, it was impossible. So I gave up. And the next time when I tried it again, I just changed my mindset and didn't start with the big goal. So I have to run 42 kilometers and a step towards that direction is 10K. I started with just lacing up the shoes and walked around the block. And the next time I added 100 meters and then 100 meters again. And I think within 6 months, I was able to complete in a very slow speed. And I think in 5 hours, my first marathon. And this is what James Clear is writing, 1% changes.
Yeah.
That it's not the big jumps. So when you want to change a habit that you do, great movement is just a little bit every day, and this builds up and sums up pretty quickly. Would you agree to that statement, or do we see it differently?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, in my company, we use that all the time. We use the term slight edge improvement a lot, which is the exact same thing. Basically, let's try to make little progress, because if you can make a little bit each day, imagine where you're going to be in a year. And that's the case whether you're in trying to accomplish business goals, or you're trying to exercise, or you're trying to lose weight, or whatever. You got to think about it long term, because that's what will really help you, of course, in the long run.
I mean, it's pretty much sales you mentioned, or we both mentioned sales. I mean, 50 calls per day starting from 0 is a big feat. It's a lot of change in one day, but why not start with 1 call? So the first day do 1 call and keep it up for 1 week. And the next week you do 2 calls. And within a year, you build your habit up to 50 calls. I think it's a great thing. But the thing with habits is, and you also mentioned it, it's really hard to change and it's really hard to build, especially when we get older. But sometimes things don't go as planned, and the environment changes, and then you have suddenly built habits in your entire organization that's just sticking there. What is your advice? How can you handle that as a leader?
Yeah, I mean, you just have to course correct as best you can. So when that starts to happen, you need to evaluate, one, how did you get to that point? And then understand that first, so that you know what you need to do to make some changes, and start guiding folks back in another direction. Now, it's the same scenario, though. You can't just make an immediate jump back to where you want to be. You may have to do it in little increments and slowly turn people back to that direction, which is the most important. Definitely. I mean, things just don't always go as you plan. I mean, they just won't. They won't in your life. They won't in your career. They won't in your business. They won't with your team. So there will be times where you look at it and you're like, that's not exactly how I thought that was going to go. Certainly with customers, same thing. Like, I've had some customer interactions that I'm like, wow. And it's always funny with customers too. I've had some cases where, like, I went way above and beyond for a customer, and they ended up being the worst customer ever. And I've had some cases where, you did like the minimum for a customer, not intentionally, but it's just they didn't require anything else, and they ended up being one of your best customers. So you never really know for sure what's going to happen.
That's great. Was just thinking, when change comes to an organization, I mean, very often people leave. And sometimes in my circle of friends, I had friends come then to me and say, I got promoted to a leadership role, but I don't want it. So they said, I am not worth of being a leader. I can't do it. I don't have the experience, and I'm not the right person. What's your advice to such comments or to such people when they get promoted and don't want to have the role because they think they are not the right fit for that?
So I think there's a variety of things to approach, a variety of ways to approach this. And first, I'm going to ask a lot of questions so I understand how to coach them. Because is it that they just really don't want to do it? If that's the case, then you definitely want to encourage them to talk to their boss and make sure that they do that. It's difficult because sometimes people feel, and some, unfortunately, I think some organizations run this way, that if somebody doesn't take a promotion, they write them off, and you don't want that scenario either. So you have to be very careful when you do that. However, if they really don't want it, then they should have that conversation with their boss. And here's the deal. Like maybe it's that they want a different role, and that's fine too. Or maybe it's that they don't want to be in leadership. They don't want to be a manager. There are people that are like that too. They are happy coming in and working their hours and doing everything they can do to help the company. It's not that they're not dedicated. They are dedicated to the company, but they don't want to lead anybody else. They want to do their thing. And that's great. Like we need people like that as well. So that's one part of it. But if I'm talking to them and I'm asking the right questions, then it's not that, but it's more that they just believe they're not capable. Then I'm going to ask a lot more questions as to why they believe that. And you really then have to kind of evaluate here. And here's the deal. This is what I would tell anybody who's watching or listening to this. If you're a new leader, or if you're thinking about this sort of thing, about applying for a promotion and you're not sure or whatever, here's the deal. And I'm sure Christian will back me up on this. You never believe that you have all the skills that you have to take the next job. While I would love to say that I have been highly confident in every role I have changed and transitioned into, I cannot say that. Because here's the bottom line. Every position that I have moved into in my career, I have thought, I have no clue if I can do this. There's always some aspect that you're not experienced in, that you aren't sure if you can do. A new way of leading, a new company. As I talked about in my career evolution, I changed like industry types multiple times. When I went and I took over the executive director, CEO in the alpaca industry, like I read a job description. The company name wasn't listed because they were hiring through an agency. And then, so I got the interview. And then when you get the interview, they tell you the company. I had to look up what an alpaca was. Like I had a general idea in my head that it was like a llama, but in the part of the country in the United States that I'm in, we have alpacas, but there are not many in the part of the country that I'm in, especially 20 years ago or 15 years ago when this was happening. So I had to look up what an alpaca was. And I was there 11 and a half years. I ran that organization. I did speaking about alpaca DNA testing and alpaca parentage validation, where you validate the parentage to understand bloodlines. I did speaking on breeding values and understanding the science behind it. And my background's not in science, but I learned so much over the course of my career, and we added things over time, and I picked it up along the way, that I was able to do those things. And I tell you that to illustrate the fact that, like, what we're talking about is imposter syndrome. Like I feel like I can't do that role, or you get in a role and you're like, I shouldn't be here. I am not qualified. And it happens. Like we all feel that way at some point. But you just have to have the confidence. You have to build a group of mentors around you so that you have people to go to talk to, that you trust, that you can say those things to. Find a coach, either a formal coach or an informal coach. Informal meaning you find some mentor, somebody that you trust that's been in business, or somebody in your family, or a friend or an acquaintance or whatever. People like to help each other. Find people that you can talk to, because that will help you along the way. But getting back to your question, then I would try to understand those things about that person. And then ultimately, if that was the case, I would still coach them around similar to what I just said and say, look, you can get there, assuming I felt they could get there. Obviously, you can get there. Like, you're not going to know everything. It's kind of one of those things. If you ever read job descriptions and stuff, in a job description, when we write job descriptions, we put like all the stuff in, right? All the stuff we would love to have. You're not going to have every single bullet point in the job description. That should not mean that you shouldn't apply if you miss 1 point or 2 points or 3 points out of 20. Apply. Like we realize as leaders and managers, like we realize you're not going to have every skill when you come into the role. Everything's going to be new. Just coming into a new company, even if you're doing the exact same thing you did at your old company, is new. So you're going to have new things. So, I mean, that's the most important, is just to understand, like, it's not a thing. Like, I assume, Christian, you had the same experience. Like, you always have some level of of lack of confidence when you enter a new role.
Absolutely. And I think it's a good thing to have, because it means progress. When people feel that they have all the skills, that they are a perfect fit for a role, there is no progress. They don't evolve as human beings. So there needs to be some sort of, you called it imposter syndrome. So there needs to be this, how should I call it? This room for improvement, this excitement to be somewhere where everything is new and to learn something new. Ending up at a position where I think, I have everything, I know everything, I can do everything, and also I get the feedback from my environment. They say, okay, so you're a perfect fit for that. It means I don't evolve and I don't improve as a human being. So people shouldn't be scared, I think.
Yeah.
When someone, let me ask you one final question. When someone enters a new leadership role and comes over this imposter syndrome and say, okay, I don't know everything, but I might be a good fit and they can evolve into that. What's your advice to such a person?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is anytime I talk about somebody coming into a leadership role, I want to be clear. Like, I don't mean young leaders. I mean, it could be people of any age and any point in their career, because we all enter leadership at different points. So sometimes when I talk about new leaders, people immediately hear young, and that's not what I mean. And really, there's about 5 things that I focus on. Some of these we've talked about already. One of the first ones is just stay curious. Like, keep learning. This is an important piece. Like, all of the best leaders that I know are people who are constantly learning. I mean, you've heard Christian and I reference several books throughout this conversation. Read books, like learn new things, take classes, take seminars, get a coach, talk to individuals, have a mentor, stay curious, like constantly learning. That continuous development is going to be important. It's going to help you adapt to change over the course of your career. The other thing is, we already talked about, like, understand, like, not everything is going to be easy. It's just not. There are going to be challenges. There are going to be things that come up that you can't imagine would ever come up. I had one point in my career that I had upset somebody and they started a petition to have me fired. Like, that is not a thing that I ever thought would happen in my career. Nothing came of it. It was just this one person that was upset and they started this thing, but I never would have thought of that. And that was difficult for me, because I'm like, how could somebody get to a point like this, that they're that mad at me? So things are going to happen. Certainly in crisis, none of us knew we were going to deal with a global pandemic. Like, that's on a large scale, obviously. So just think of those things. Along those same lines is, when you have setbacks, when you have challenges, you have to view them as learning opportunities. It's not going to feel like it at the time, because it's going to be stressful and it's going to be hard and it may be difficult to get past. But you have to try to keep telling yourself, if I can just get to the backside of this, again, that statement I said earlier, imagine what you're going to learn. Imagine the experience you're going to have, you're going to gain, and how you're going to be able to use that moving forward. One of the other things is listen. And not just listen, but I always tell people, listen to understand. Don't just listen to respond. So I think sometimes when we're listening to somebody, we think of what we want to say, and then we're like, ooh, I have something I need to say. And that's all you can think about then. All you're thinking about at that point is what you're going to say next. You're not hearing what they're actually saying. So listen to understand people. Also, one of my mentors, along with the listening thing recently, told me when I was talking to him, and it makes total sense, spend time listening, but then also when it's time to act, then act. Like you are, as a leader, it's your responsibility to listen to people and understand and get feedback. But there also becomes a time when you actually have to make a decision and move forward and act. And then the last thing is, and we talked about it already, just be kind to people, be compassionate, understand that everybody has crap going on in their lives. Everybody has stress going on in their lives. Every coworker, every person that you talk to every single day has something going on in their life that you may not be aware of. And that means that they're going to have bad days. They're going to be stressed. They're going to say something stupid to you at some point. Do not hold that against anybody, because everybody has bad days. If it becomes a pattern, then yes, of course, you need to deal with it. But just be kind, be compassionate. We need more of that in this world in general, and certainly within leading companies and within our teams and everything as well. So those are the main things that I would say to any person who's coming into a leadership role is just think of those 5 things.
Great words at the end of the conversation. I like that. Be kind and compassionate. I think I couldn't agree more. It's what the world needs these days, kindness and compassion. I think this is, if I would see more on social media of these 2 things, I think the world would definitely be a better place.
Yes, or maybe just if we would see less of social media sometimes.
Yeah, turn off the news, turn off social media.
Yes.
Darby, it was a great conversation. I'm at the end of my question. Is there anything you would like to add?
No, I would say if anybody just wants to learn more about me or my book, you can go to my website at beindispensable.com. I'm active on most social media. All the social media links are there. I'm most active on LinkedIn. You can also just search for Darby Vannier on LinkedIn. Also, I don't have a full audio version of my book. However, I did record the preface as an audio piece, and you can get that for free if you go to beindispensable.com/audio. So for your listeners and your viewers, they can access that there and get an idea of what the book's about and hear me read the preface at least and see if it's something that they're interested in.
Super. I will add the link to the description of the podcast. Darby, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for this great insight in your life and your book. I wish you, your family, and your team all the best for the future. And I wish you a nice day. It's in the morning still.
Thanks, Christian. You as well.